As a word, it references prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control, often leading to mental pressure or distress. So we can see in the very definition of the term, this notion that it turns into a mental distress of some sort. So noticing the quality of prolonged. So this can differentiate it, for instance, from a trauma that's from a single event. This is something that's prolonged. So there's some sort of prolonged exposure. It's unjust. And by saying unjust, it suddenly is located in the world, not just in our mind. It's concerns control. So that becomes really important when we discuss self-determination. And it involves mental pressure or distress. Now, I put this image there. Not that it can be quantified, but just to give a sense of relationships, where in Buddhism, we find this strong orientation on the first teaching the Buddha gave, and the whole raison d'etre of meditation and mindfulness in particular had to do with suffering, what's been translated as suffering, but actually the term is dukkha, which may be more accurately described as struggle. So we have this broader issue of struggle or suffering, and oppression as just one, not just one, but as a type of suffering, but not necessarily all suffering would be labeled oppressive or oppression. Likewise, in secular scientific mindfulness, where you find this strong medicalization and orientation on mental illness, is actually a smaller, reduced, reductionary view of suffering as mental illness, or a focus on suffering associated with mental illness. So in using and focusing on oppression, we're broadening this sense of the purpose of mindfulness, and yet perhaps not as widely as you find in Buddhism. And also, if we look at that word oppression, we see it lying somewhere between suppression, which has to do with the world, and repression, which is exclusively psychological. And again, noticing that it can involve trauma, it can lead to trauma, like PTSD, and it is also, I include a study that has found this relationship between oppression and disorders associated with trauma, like PTSD, but it is not necessarily the same as trauma. Trauma cannot involve oppression, and oppression may not involve trauma, but the effects can be quite similar. So, and also, it isn't only personal. The notion of oppression, it's something we share with a group. And it also is something that is systemic and contextual. So we'll look a bit at that as well. And we can think of, ways that oppression arises as well. What are the conditions that we notice that accompany it? So again, we're talking about externally. What are we experiencing in the world that comes to us as the internally with the experience of oppression? So issues like exploitation or subjugation, for instance, which really has to do with economic subservience and dependence. And in this, I might reference, Marx, for instance, emphasis on production as a source of social injustice that comes from the exploitation of people's labor. So we can think of productive labor, and then in feminist critiques of reproductive labor. So it can become exploitation associated, for instance, with even biological functions like reproduction that go to women's experiences of oppression in some cases, or with other factors. And I'll draw your attention to a recent book some of you may have read, called Caste, where Isabel, sorry, I forget her last name and I can't see it, outlines how racism in African-American experience of racism, so-called, in the US is actually not about race. It's about caste, and it's a fabulously argued book about that it's really about keeping a subservient class of people, as you might find in India, for instance, with their class system, or you did at least. Marginalization, so exclusion and isolation, as Simone de Beauvoir described in The Second Sex, that the experience of women was being excluded from society and from fully functioning as human beings. Issues of representation, which go to the culture, how a group of people is presented as partially human or dehumanized, degraded, or caricatured in the culture. And on a more personal level, it often comes with humiliation or in interactions. It could involve powerlessness, which goes to Ryan and Desi's theory of self-determination and the effects of learned helplessness and the shift to external locus of control. And one thing I'd like to talk about just at a bit more length is Frantz Fanon, which some of you may have heard of. So a well-known political theorist, that's how he's discussed, or as a political philosopher who died in 1961, but wrote about the French in Algeria. And the book in particular that he wrote was published just as he died, The Wretched of the Earth. And the interesting thing about him, which isn't sometimes emphasized, he was looking at colonialism, is that he was a psychiatrist. So his experience of the evil, the problem with colonialism, its violence, was in a mental institute that was serving the indigenous Muslim people who were Muslim. And he said they were dehumanized in the way they were treated. It was a systematic dehumanization, not just in the mental, he was talking about colonialism, but he saw it through this experience of how politics and mental illness intersected. And interestingly, this was in his letter of resignation to the French colonial government, that he would no longer participate in this systematic dehumanization. And he said that involves the decerebralization of a people. So he's actually seeing it in terms of the effect on the brain and describing it that way. It's not just metaphoric, that somehow this higher cortical functioning is being suppressed and denied to these people through the effects of colonialism. And that's will be dealt with in more depth by Michael Yellowbird. So an interesting intro there. And he also wrote how violence, when you're treated with violence in a society as under colonialism, it turns inside, and the objects of violence become subjects of violence. So the communities become subjected to increased violence between one another. At the same time, those are external features. The key thing about oppression is that it doesn't exist outside. If it doesn't get inside, it's not really oppression. So how is it getting inside? Well, it starts probably with processes of identification. So we'll talk a bit more about the brain, but if there's threats going on, there may be a tendency to identify outside the group, your own group being threatened with the people who are doing the threats. So there is this kind of record in various bodies of research around the tendency for people who are oppressed to identify with their oppressors, and that this becomes internalized, can become internalized and create a kind of split identity as yourself as both oppressor and oppressed. This word internalization, which was used, for instance, by Paulo Freire in his famous book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has been reworded by some, like Versi, who I cite later, as appropriation. So the interesting thing about appropriation is that it's a term used about culture. You appropriate culture. So in a sense, it's locating oppression as a culture that is internalized both by the oppressed or the privileged, who can be the oppressors, and creates particular patterns in that, including for people with, for white people, say in a racist in the United States, a view of a threat to their status. So status threat can lead to their appropriating oppressive discourses. Another term that's used in racism in particular is colorism, where there's an internalization of views about worth based on skin color and skin tone that can affect people. And another term that's helpful comes from self-determination theory, which is introjected or external regulation. So instead of it, being able to function internally with internal intrinsic regulation, where we're connected to our bodies and experience and able to adjust to maintain and sustain well-being, there's a loss of autonomy, where control becomes externalized, as in is not internalized. And I wanted to emphasize in particular, I don't know if anyone had this emotion come up. It is the emotion that comes up for me in a memory, which is shame. Shame is highly associated with the experience of oppression. And there is research on that it's reduced, for instance, through a mindfulness-based program. In that study, it was ACT, which is acceptance commitment therapy. Okay, so now, okay, well then what is anti-oppression? What are we cultivating with anti-oppression? And we might consider it centrally about autonomy. So autonomy is a term that maybe, what do you say, rubs some people the wrong way who like to criticize modernity. But in this case, autonomy is really used as an ecological concept. So autonomy is something that is understood to have biological or ecological significance. That is the ability of the organism to adapt and cohere in their living system, which of course includes social systems. It's the capacity to continuously self-regulate, to exercise agency. I think this is really important. What's going on with the agency of the person experiencing oppression, and how mindfulness can assist. And finally, that the degree of autonomy is associated over time with the degree of well-being that a person experiences, which we can understand not just as subjective happiness or satisfaction, but also as flourishing, the ability to kind of manifest your potential.